I'm going to do this as quickly as I possibly can. Let me start by saying one of the reasons that I like being on PBI's board, besides the great work that we get to do and help facilitate, is that I tend to get pretty good jobs as a result of being a member of the board. I got, and I'll just talk about two of them now. The first one, Tom Sabatino and I had the honor a couple of dinners ago, some of you might remember, to announce that we were going to do this Esther Lardent Award, which was really, really a great thing. And here I am now with obviously the best job in the House, of course, besides Greg's, who gets to interview, lead the chat, if you would, with Justice Ginsburg. But I'm honored to present the inaugural Esther F. Lardent Hall of Fame Award for Excellence in Pro Bono to the Honorable Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Ginsburg, as we all know, is a true legend in the law and an inspiration to countless admirers. I'll just point out some of the commonplace things that we might want to think about with regard to the justice. What other Supreme Court justice has a Tumblr dedicated to him or her? What other Supreme Court justice is notorious? And for those of you who don't know, what other justice has a new documentary which premiered at the 2018 Sundance Film Festival? Pretty amazing. Pop culture aside, Justice Ginsburg has inspired generations of legal professionals. I'm sure that includes most, if not everybody, in the room tonight. But her career, and more importantly, her life, represent tales of triumph over discrimination, exclusion, and the status quo. She was one of 9 women in her class at Harvard Law School. I hate to read this line, but I'm going to read it anyway. Despite her success at Harvard and obvious talents, no law firm would hire her. That didn't stop her. She became the first tenured woman at Columbia Law School. She co-founded the Women's Rights Law Reporter, the first U.S. law journal exclusively dedicated to focus on women's rights. She also co-founded and led the Women's Rights Project at the ACLU and argued 6 cases before the Supreme Court in 1980. In 1980, she was appointed to the federal bench, and in 1993 to the Supreme Court. Throughout her time on the Supreme Court, Justice Ginsburg has made incredible strides for equal treatment on the basis of gender, including her decision that influenced the passage of the Lilly Ledbetter Act, the Fair Pay Act of 2009. These accomplishments, of course, were not without challenges. Rather than be discouraged or defeated, her experience has shaped her dedication to championing equal treatment for all. While tenaciously pursuing equal justice, she's also illuminated a path for generations of aspiring lawyers and judges, for that matter, to follow. The judge has been a tireless advocate for increasing pro bono participation and in support for legal aid services, 2 subjects near and dear to our hearts. She's also a friend of PBI's late founding president, Esther Lardent, one more reason why the inaugural Hall of Fame award is such a tribute. Esther was dedicated to fighting for civil rights and equal protection under the law throughout her 45-year career. She pioneered creative approaches to the firm Pro Bono Challenge Initiative, which is now the standard for law firm engagement in pro bono. And she also expanded PBI's mission to include strengthening pro bono by in-house legal departments and by partnering with the Association of Corporate Counsel to create corporate pro bono, which cultivates in-house pro bono engagement. And now, more than 20 years since Esther's vision came into being, as PBI, pro bono has become not just something we do, but a way of life for hundreds of law firms and legal departments and thousands of lawyers and legal staff, continuing her vision to more effectively serve those in need through pro bono legal services. One of the things I got to do as a benefit associated with being on the board was just have a little handshake with Justice Ginsburg when she came in. And I asked her if there was anything that she wanted me to say that would not be in the written remarks. And she told me that on January 1st, 2018, she became a great grandmother. Justice Ginsburg, on behalf of PBI, congratulations and thank you for all you have done and all you continue to do to support pro bono. It is my great privilege to present to you the inaugural Esther F. Lardent Hall of Fame Award for Excellence in Pro Bono.
I am hugely honored to receive an award bearing Esther Lardent's name. Louis D. Brandeis thought that the lawyers of his day had neglected their professional obligation to use their talents to advance the well-being of people who lacked social and economic advantage. We hear too much of the corporation lawyer, Brandeis said, and too little of the people's lawyer. It was his belief and Esther Lardent's dream that true members of the legal profession can and should be both a corporate lawyer and a people's lawyer. Esther devoted her life to making Brandeis's hope and her dream come true. The Pro Bono Institute and the lawyers devoted to its mission today play a vital part in promoting a legal system open and accessible to all. Without any government prodding, all gathered here have taken the initiative to serve those without the wherewithal to pay for legal assistance. Your compensation is not monetary. It is the large satisfaction one gains from helping to repair tears in society, from doing something outside yourself, from making people's lot a little better because of your aid. Esther was indomitable until a dread disease silenced her. She was indomitable in striving to make PBI what it has become. May we draw strength from her intelligence, inspiration, courage, and tireless efforts to remain steadfast defenders of the public good. Thank you so much. Please, everyone be seated.
Okay. I've got some questions for Justice Ginsburg, but the first is a comment. I am scared to death that I'm going to mess this up. I haven't been this nervous since I got married. Okay, now it's out of the way. So, Justice Ginsburg, you've been on the Supreme Court, as David said, since 1993, and a federal judge since 1980. So in nearly 40 years as a jurist, you've had the opportunity to work with incredible legal minds and scholars. Can you just share some of the lessons you've learned from your colleagues over that time?
I would sum it up in one word, and that word is collegiality. The Supreme Court is the most collegial place I have ever worked, including any law faculty, including the quite collegial DC Circuit. We can't do our job effectively unless we genuinely respect each other, and in most cases, beyond that, very much like each other. So collegiality is what makes our institution work, and it is what is sadly lacking in other branches of government at this time.
Now, the advantage of having the questions on the cards prohibits me from following up from time to time. Of the many opinions and dissents that you've written, which one are you the most proud of?
Now, that is a question like asking me which of my 4 grandchildren, 2 step-grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild is my favorite. But if I had to pick 2 that are among my favorites, I would say yes to the Virginia Military Institute case. Last year, I was at VMI to celebrate the 21st anniversary of that decision and the great success it has been. I met with the women cadets. They still go through the same rat line, but they survive it intact. They want to be engineers, nuclear scientists. There are now women on the faculty. There is a woman on the board of trustees, and the general who is the superintendent of VMI just couldn't say enough about what a positive change that has been. From the most obvious, that is, they immediately upgraded their applicant pool. Then one other case that has already been mentioned tonight is Lilly Ledbetter's case. Lilly Ledbetter, I think most of you know, was an area manager in a Goodyear tire plant. When she came on board in the late 70s, she was the only woman doing the job. One day she got a slip of paper in her mailbox with a series of numbers, and she recognized immediately what that was. It was the pay that all of the area managers received, and she saw that her name was at the very bottom, below someone she had trained to do the job. So she said, enough, I'm going to sue. And she brought a Title VII action. She got a substantial jury verdict, and when her case got to the Supreme Court, the court was sharply divided 5-4, but 5 of my colleagues thought she sued too late. Title VII requires that you complain within 180 days of the discriminatory incident. Now, Lilly had been there since the late 70s, and by the 90s, she had long endured beyond 180 days. And my view of that case was simple. It was every time she received a paycheck, the discrimination was renewed. And the tagline of my opinion was, the ball is now in Congress's court to correct the error into which my colleagues have fallen. In very short order, with large majorities on both sides of the aisle, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act was passed. It was a soul of simplicity. It simply adopted the paycheck rule. But in the course of my opinion, I tried to explain why my colleagues' view didn't make any sense. That is, suppose Lilly had sued early on, you can bet what the defense would have been by the employer. It would have been, it has nothing to do with Lilly being a woman. She just doesn't do the job as well as the men. But when year after year, her employer has given her good performance ratings, that defense is no longer available. She has a winnable case, but the court said she sued too late. Any woman of Lilly Ledbetter's time knows that when you're the first woman to come on board, you don't want to be seen as a complainer. You don't want to rock the boat. So it was a case that I think every woman and many men understood. And it was good to see that dialogue going on between the court and the Congress. Congress had the benefit of our divided opinions and then did the right thing.
Great. Is there any legal issue or decision on which you've changed your mind? Any decision that if you had to go back and the chance to go back and do it again, you would decide differently?
And that's a question that I don't think about, because I was given great advice for a judge when I joined the DC Circuit. A senior colleague, Ed Tam, came to visit me and said, I'd like to give you some advice. It will help you do this challenging job. He said, you're going to work hard on every case, you're going to give it your all, do the best you can. But when it's over, when the opinion is released, don't look back. Don't waste time worrying over what is done. Go on to the next case and give it your all. And over the years, that has proved to be very good advice.
Our profession has a great tradition of mentorship. Can you talk a little bit about the mentors you've had throughout your career, as well as your own experience being a mentor to others?
Mentors. Well, perhaps I should say that in my growing up years, there were two women I looked up to. One was a girl, and she was fictional. She was Nancy Drew. And the other was Amelia Earhart, who was real. I had no lawyers and judges to look up to because women were barely there. One person who helped set me along the path I followed was a constitutional law professor at Cornell. I was taking that course as an undergraduate, and I was working for this professor, Professor Robert E. Cushman, as a researcher. He wanted me to be aware that our country was going through a rather bad period. The early 50s, the heyday of Senator Joe McCarthy, when many members of our Congress saw a communist in every corner. People were being hauled before the House Un-American Activities Committee, the Senate investigating committees, and being asked about some group they belonged to during the depth of the Depression that was pink-tinged. The professor pointed out to me that lawyers were standing up for these people, the kind of lawyers that are in this room today, and reminding our Congress that there is a Fifth Amendment that protects us against self-incrimination, and there is a First Amendment which says we have the right to think, speak, and write as we believe and not as a big brother government tells us is the right way to think, write, and speak. So I got the idea that being a lawyer was pretty nifty. You can help things become a little better. You could repair things that were torn in your society. Another influential person was the best law teacher I ever had, Benjamin Kaplan. From day one in his civil procedure class, I came to love that subject. I would happily write all of the procedure decisions that come to the Supreme Court, but we can't do that because none of us are allowed to be specialists. I couldn't say, I'd like to mention at least two women who I came to know and admire later on. And they were both instrumental in moving the ACLU in the direction of equality. The ACLU's client was the First Amendment, freedom of speech and press. They were urging that also fundamental to a good society is the equal stature of men and women. One of those women was Dorothy Kenyon, whose mission it was to get rid of all the laws that either didn't put women on juries at all or gave them the opportunity to opt in or opt out. And then another remarkable woman who was on the Equality Committee of the ACLU was Pauline Murray, a woman who is finally being recognized for the courageous, far-sighted person that she was. I had read an article in the mid-1960s that Pauline and Mary Eastwood wrote, and the title of it was Jane Crow and the Law. In it, Pauline Murray had identified laws, federal and state, that differentiated arbitrarily on the basis of gender. You can read about Pauline, and in one book, excellent book by Patricia Scott, is The Firebrand and the First Lady. So Pauline is the firebrand, First Lady is Eleanor Roosevelt. Those two had a very close relationship. And the other, by Roz Rosenberg, is called Jane Crow. Pauline had attended Howard Law School in the 40s. She and her classmates that she organized desegregated all the restaurants around Howard University. This is in the 40s, way before the sit-ins of the 60s. So it was my great good fortune to have known her. And finally, one other I'd like to mention is a woman named Bernita Shelton Matthews. She was the first woman ever appointed to a federal district judgeship. And when I came on board on the DC circuit, she was in her 90s, but still coming into the office. And the stories that that woman told, oh, well, I'll just tell one of them because it's... So Bernita Shelton Matthews was a specialist in eminent domain. And when Chief Justice Taft decided that the Supreme Court should not be housed inside the Capitol, but should have its own home, the property that was identified included the space that had been the headquarters of the National Woman's Party. This is the party that was responsible for introducing the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923 and every year thereafter. Anyway, their headquarters was on that site. The government offered a rather low price, took the position that this was just a ramshackle old building and it wasn't worth very much. Bernita Shelton Matthews said, this, what you call a ramshackle old building, was the Capitol. It was the temporary Capitol when the Capitol burned down in the War of 1812. And beyond that, it was used in the Civil War to house notorious Confederate spies. The government, it was not in a listening mood. Then, to prove her case, Bernita Shelton Matthews had a photograph of a notorious Confederate spy, a woman, inside that building. And at that point, the government folded, and she got for the National Women's Party the highest condemnation award that up till then had ever been paid. Well, that's mentors enough.
Okay, now we're going to come up into the current time. As David mentioned, and this is probably an understatement, you've become somewhat of a cult figure. You have the Tumblr, the notorious RBG Tumblr in the book, and Kate McKinnon plays you on Saturday Night Live. How do you feel about being a cult figure?
It's positively amazing. To be almost 85 years old, and everyone wants to take his or her picture with me. I like how the notorious RBG started. It was started by a second-year student at NYU Law School, very soon after the Supreme Court handed down the Shelby County case, the case that held that the Voting Rights Act pre-clearance system that had worked so well could not be used until Congress redid the formula to detect what districts and what states were still discriminating in the franchise. This student was angry. She realized, as many people did, that the chance that Congress would redo the formula was slim to none, because what member of Congress was going to stand up and say, my district still discriminates against African Americans, so keep us on the list. On the other hand, overwhelming majorities on both sides had renewed the Voting Rights Act with the formula that was there from the start. Also, the act had a way out. That is, if the district was in compliance for X number of years, it could get off the pre-clearance requirement. At first, this student was angry at what the court had done, and then she decided, well, anger, this is not a useful emotion. She's going to do something positive. And what she started the Tumblr with my dissenting opinion in the Shelby County case. And then from there, it took out into the wild blue yonder. So how did she pick the name, the notorious RBG? Well, she knew that I had something important in common with the notorious rapper, the notorious B.I.G. What did we two have in common? We were both born and bred in Brooklyn, New York.
I definitely don't want to cut you off on that one. Okay. It's 2018, and it's been well reported that you've hired law clerks through 2020, well ahead of the normal hiring schedule for Supreme Court clerks. Can you talk a little bit about that decision?
There were so many good applicants. So I decided, why pick only 4? I'll pick 8, and then I'll distribute them between the 2 years.
You've led an exceptional and in many, many ways a groundbreaking life and fantastic career. And along the way, I'm sure you faced many interesting choices, opportunities, and decisions. Looking back, what's the best decision you made personally and the best decision you made professionally, and why?
The answer to both questions is the same. Best decision I ever made, personally and professionally, was to marry Martin D. Ginsburg. We met when Marty was 18 and I was 17. He was in his second year at Cornell. I was in my first. And he was the first boy I ever met who cared that I had a brain. And Marty was always my biggest booster. As in every good marriage, one adjusts to the other. So in the years that Marty was going up the ladder in his law firm, determined to become a partner in 5 years, during that time, I suppose that I did the lion's share of the work at home and with the children. In the late 60s, when I got into the equality business, Marty realized what I was doing was tremendously important. So without our ever having a discussion, he took over, well, he took over the kitchen entirely with the help of my food-loving children who, at a young age, could tell the enormous difference between Daddy's excellent cooking and Mommy's nothing you want to write home about. Marty was so secure in himself that he never regarded me as any kind of threat. Far from it. He was always my biggest booster. He made me think that I was better than I started out thinking I was. So that's my answer to you.
That's right. So Jim and David both mentioned earlier some of the accomplishments. You were the second woman appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court, but you were a trailblazer long before that, the first tenured female professor at Columbia University, the first female member of 2 law reviews, the second woman on the D.C. Court of Appeals, and on and on. What advice would you give to young lawyers, especially young female lawyers, who want to break through the glass ceiling and are facing obstacles that seem entrenched and unsurmountable?
First, I'd like to correct what was said. I was not the first or even the second woman on the Harvard Law Review. I was the 4th. Priscilla Holmes was first, and then Nancy Goldring, and then Nancy Boxley, and then now the question was what I would say to young women. Appreciate how far we have come. When I graduated from law school, these were pre-Title VII days. Employers were upfront and saying they didn't want any lady lawyers, or We had a woman lawyer once, and she was dreadful. My response, how many men? It didn't work out to your complete satisfaction. But no matter, for my generation, it was powerfully hard to get that first job. Once you got your foot in the door, the women did at least as well as the men. So the second job was not the same hurdle. Now, we have no more closed doors. It's no longer the case that if a woman gets into a sizable law firm, she will be put in the estates department. Women can do anything in the law. I clerked for 2 years in the Southern District of New York for a district judge. There were no women in the criminal division of the U.S. Attorney's Office. Why? The excuse given was, we have some pretty tough criminal types that we have to deal with. And I wondered at that answer, because women were working for legal aid and directly representing those tough types. So there was so much that it was irrational, and that is gone. So if you have the determination, now you can be whatever you want to be. Of course, we haven't reached nirvana, and the way to move things forward is to get together with like-minded people, women as well as men, and urge the changes that you think are needed. Firms, it's surprising to me that firms haven't become more flexible, given that everyone has the entire law library at his or her fingertips. But then stand up for what you believe is right, but do it in company.
I'm sure, like the rest of the country, you've been following the Me Too movement and the heightened focus on addressing sexual harassment and assault. And if you could share your thoughts on the movement, and especially any thoughts you have on how this recent wave of feminism can be more inclusive and ensure that the voices of all women, including women of color, LGBT women, women living in poverty, are all heard and represented in this conversation.
On the subject of sexual harassment, I'd like to mention another McKinnon, Kitty McKinnon, Catherine McKinnon. In the middle 70s, I received a manuscript of a book called Sexual Harassment in the Workplace. It was written by Kitty McKinnon, and her idea was, this belongs under Title VII. This is discrimination on the basis of gender. I read her book, and it was a real eye-opener. I said, yes, of course. It belongs under Title VII. The courts came to agree. But this latest is another example of strength in numbers. Women won't be listened to if they come just one at a time to complain. My hope is that this Me Too movement will work for everyone. That is, not just the Hollywood stars, but the maid who works at a hotel, for example. And that it won't be simply the women coming forward and saying Me Too. It will be men who realize there's something wrong in the culture when that kind of dominance is allowed to put down people. So men who will call attention to the kind of behavior that should be off the table. That's important. I think it's great that the issue has finally come to light. I'm told that some of the women who complained about Harvey Weinstein had done it years earlier and done it to the press, told the press, but they weren't yet ready to listen.
Given your long history of working to advance gender equality, what do you think is the next frontier for women's rights advocates? What issue and claims would you like to see these advocates working on and eventually, if needed, bringing them to the court?
One important area is what has been called unconscious bias. It works in race discrimination, in gender discrimination. And my best illustration of it is the symphony orchestra. When I was growing up, one never saw a woman in a symphony orchestra, except perhaps playing the harp. A well-known music critic for the New York Times, Howard Taubman, said, "Blindfold me, and I can tell you if it's a woman at the piano or a man." So someone said, "Okay, let's try you out." He failed the blindfold test miserably. He got all mixed up, and then he realized, and he admitted this in a piece he wrote, that he had, certainly not deliberate, but this unconscious bias. So someone in the music business got the simple but an incredible idea. Let's drop a curtain. Let's drop a curtain so the people who are auditioning for positions won't be seen by the judges. And that simple change, the drop curtain, almost overnight, began to change the composition of our symphony orchestras. What had gone on before was not deliberate discrimination. And I was telling this story once at a music festival, and a young woman, a violinist, came up to me and said, "You left something out of the story." What did I leave out? You left out that when we are auditioning, we come on stage shoeless, so the judges won't hear a woman's heels coming on the stage. One of my favorite examples of the unconscious bias was a Title VII case that was brought against AT&T in the late 70s. And it was for disproportionately failing to promote women into middle management jobs. The women did fine on all the standard criteria, but they flunked disproportionately at the very last rung. And that was what was called a total person test. Total person test was an interviewer interviewing the candidate for promotion, and that's when women dropped out. Why did that happen? When the interviewer is dealing with someone who looks the same, he has a comfort level. I know this person, he's like me. But in conversing with someone who's different skin color, different sex, he feels a certain discomfort talking to that person. He really doesn't know what she's about. And that gets reflected in the choice. because we can't drop a curtain in that situation, I think people have to become aware that there is this unconscious bias operating. Another big challenge for professional women is what has been called the work-life balance. How do you have a satisfying professional career and at the same time a good family life? Well, my own experience is what it takes is a supportive partner, as someone who believes a child should be brought up by two parents. And firms, I think most firms now have some kind of parental leave. Parental leave and flexible time. I can think of the 17 years when I was a law teacher, I had flex time. I didn't work fewer hours than someone who was there from 9 till midnight at a law firm. But I could divide up the day so that I could be with my children when they needed me. When they went to sleep, I could go back to the books. That appreciation that a worker may be more effective for the firm if she's not constantly worrying about how things are going in school. Well, I can't resist telling you my favorite school story. Anyway, I have a son who is today a very fine human, but growing up, he was what I call lively and what his teachers called hyperactive. And I would get called to come down to the school to hear about his latest escapade on average of once a month. And one day when I was particularly weary, I stayed up all night writing a brief. I said to the caller, "This child has two parents. Please alternate calls." And this time, it's his father's turn. So Marty went off to the school. When he got there, he was told by 3 stone-faced school administrators, "Your son stole the elevator." It was a handheld elevator. The operator had gone out to have a cigarette. One of my son's classmates dared him to take a group of kindergartners from the first floor to the top floor, which he did. And Marty's response to this news of James's terrible misdeed was, "So he stole the elevator. How far could he take it?" And I don't know whether it was Marty's sense of humor or the reluctance to call a man away from his work. There was no quick change in my son's behavior, but the calls came barely once a semester.
Okay, I'm down to the next to the last question. If you had to pick 5 words to describe your experience as a Supreme Court justice.
I better take my list.
5 words, what would they be?
Okay, the first one is challenging. It's constantly challenging. The second is all-consuming. The third is exhilarating. It is the best job in the world, I think, for a lawyer. The next one is exhausting. I've never had a job at which I worked harder than this one. And what did I put down for the, oh yes, the last one is tremendously satisfying.
Now, Justice Ginsburg, for the last question, with your permission, I'm going to reveal my secret, which was to recruit somebody to help me put this interview together. Jackie Perlow is a recent Harvard Law School graduate and an Equal Justice Fellow being sponsored by PNC and my old law firm, Reed Smith. She's living in Pittsburgh and helping immigrants and refugees navigate the educational system where they need legal help and legal support. So Jackie has read the books, watched the YouTubes, read the Tumblr, and helped me put this interview together. And her bargain was that I would let her ask the last question. So with your permission,
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Justice, for being here and sharing your time and wisdom with all of us. As Greg said earlier, you've definitely become a revered figure in many circles, and in my opinion, nobody loves Ruth Bader Ginsburg more than young female attorneys. So knowing that, in helping Greg prep for this interview, I reached out to some of my law school friends to see what they would want to ask you if they could ask you anything. And I got some interesting responses. But overall, I think what people were most interested in was knowing, given the negative rhetoric that's out there right now and the partisan climate that we're living in, what gives you hope? What, if anything, are you optimistic about right now?
And what gives me hope? Well, Nancy, you do. I have great faith in the millennials, and we can see it every day. Think of this latest horrendous incident when school children are standing up and saying, enough of this. We want something done about it, and we're not going to be quiet until something is done. I was exhilarated by the Women's March. So many women of every race, religion, coming together, and the high spirits that we saw that day would give anyone confidence that people care about our country's most basic values, and will stand up and be heard when the country is straying from those values. I was pleased to see that at Sundance this year, where they showed over 200 films, most of them were directed by women. Now, that is something new. It didn't used to be that way. And I also find hopeful the numbers of women who have announced their interest in running for public office. I mean, that's at every level, the local level, state level, and federal. So I think we're going to see some big changes. And I hope I will be around when they come to fruition.